there's no doubt the United States hates Iranians too, and the United States would love to do this to Persians as well. It's just, I think Iran is too powerful and nobody has the guts to lose another war. I mean, look, you couldn't defeat Iraq. There's no way you're going to defeat Iran. You couldn't win in Afghanistan. How are you going to beat a country like Iran? It's like madness.
I'm going to ask you a question now, and I just want to get your temperature on it. In a way, what do you agree with and what do you disagree with looking at that moment in 1919 and European colonialism taking root or creating damage, because it doesn't take root then essentially? How do you see that? Is it fair to call that like a fifth crusade, or is this a break and something different?
Oh, I definitely think it is another crusade, in part because they saw it that way. I'm trying to remember the name of the French general. Gouraud is the name in my head, but I'm probably wrong. So when the French, there's a battle called the Battle of Maysalun in 1920. So after the treaties in Europe that end World War I are done, it's decided that they're going to basically do Sykes-Picot and carve up the Middle East and give pieces to France and Britain. Now, originally Sykes-Picot was going to give Iraq to France because Britain was going to get southern Iran and Russia was going to get northern Iran, but Russia goes communist, so they don't want to invade Iran. So the British consolation prize for not getting southern Iran is to get Iraq. But now the French are going to get Syria. So the French invade, they fight the Battle of Maysalun, the Syrian army is defeated. King Faisal had tried to make a Arab state that would include the Hejaz Mountains, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, Palestine, and he wanted to make a single state in that land, and he's defeated. He made his capital Damascus. He's defeated, and so that's over. The French general, and Gouraud is the name in my head, but it's probably wrong, goes to Salah ad-Din's tomb, kicks it, and says, "Saladin, we're back," which tells me all I need to know whether or not that was another crusade or not. I mean, in their mind, it was another crusade, which is what makes it one. The British wanted Palestine because they wanted to be the guys who had Jerusalem. This was, King Richard the Lionheart never retook Jerusalem. That was his dream, and he dies having not done it. And I think that this, in the mind of the English, they had done it. They had fulfilled Richard's goal, and they took Jerusalem. The English actually resisted the creation of Israel in part because I think they saw this as the undoing of their success. They were also determined not to let the Palestinian state form because, the UN had partitioned Palestine between Israel and Palestine. They succeeded in one and failed in the other. But I do think they definitely saw it as a crusade.
Now, of course, there's this massive genocide that's been raging for 19 months, and that before that there was 75 years of occupation by Israel of the region, and many critiques of Israel. They see this as sort of an extension of the colonial settler project. They also see the unabashed sort of support that the West and Western powers, Europe and the USA, give to Israel. They see this kind of also from the lens of trying to extend what was once like an extension of Europe. In which way do you see that playing out? And do you think that's fair, or which stage is this a case of just its new sort of Israeli identity, which is very different to Jewish identity historically in the region? Or do you see it just as this is a settler colonial state that's been imposed on the region from Europe, or do you which way is that interplaying that and sort of the indigenousness? I wouldn't say indigenousness, that's the wrong word maybe, but sort of the organic momentum of Zionism itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, one question to ask is, does Israel participate in Eurovision? And then another question is, when Israel plays soccer matches, football matches, who are they playing against again? So it is obvious that it is a settler colonial project. The Ashkenazi are the leadership of it, and the Ashkenazi are, of course, Jewish Europeans. So at its heart, it is a European settler colonial project. Now, it's complicated and it's messy because I think one of the things that's really fascinating to me is, if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semite is the charge that everybody keeps throwing. And of course, the reality is there's no correlation between the two. They're completely unrelated, to the point where I guarantee you that the majority of American Zionists are anti-Semitic, that their support for Zionism is because they don't want Jews living in Europe and the United States, and they figure if there's an Israel, then the Jews are living in the Middle East, not in Europe and not the United States. And they also see it as an extra win because then those Jews are killing Semites because Palestinians are Semitic. And so it's like a double win. It's like Hitler's wet dream. He just, I got rid of the Jews from Europe and they're killing Semites. How could it be any better? And so at some level, there's this, it's not like it's the English coming and massacring a native population of, Cherokee and Ojibwa and replacing them with the settler. They've ejected the unwanted part of Europe into the Middle East. And so in a strange way, the Israelis are kind of victims in this. They've accepted their victimization, but in a way they're fulfilling the anti-Semitic goals of Europe and the anti-Semitic goals of the United States. Having said that, their dream is to become Middle Easterners, and they want to eat falafel and couscous, and they want to have music that sounds like it's organically from the Middle East, and they've banned, or at least severely discouraged, the Jewish languages like Ladino and Yiddish from being spoken because they want it to be Hebrew, because they think that makes them more organically and more authentically Middle Eastern, even though, for all intents and purposes, Ladino is an organic Middle Eastern language. Obviously, Yiddish is related to Slavic and German, but, they're in a way, in a really strange way, they're rejecting their own Europeanness at some level to be as authentically Middle Eastern as they can be, and that's the Ashkenazi population. Then there's the Eastern Jews or the Mizrahi Jews, and then there's the Sephardic Jews that have been brought along, the Jewish Ethiopians and the Jewish Chinese and the Jewish Indians who have sort of been pulled into this, the Jewish Persians who have been sucked into this thing that have sort of gone along, and they're treated like second and third class citizens. They don't have the same kind of status as Ashkenazi. And so you see this sort of traditional European style racism superimposed within Israeli society, which then, of course, makes me go, oh my God, it's really, truly like a South African style apartheid system where, the whites are on the top, the Asians are in the middle, the coloreds, and then the blacks at the bottom. And it's structured in such a similar way. And of course, in this case, the Palestinians are the blacks, and the Jewish Ethiopians who are actually black would be the third class, and they'd be the coloreds. And so in so many ways, they've recreated all of the worst of Europe and European civilization, while at the same time still being this population of people that Europe literally pogromed for 850 years, ultimately resulting in the pogrom of pogroms, the Holocaust. And the European solution was, why don't you go live in Palestine? If the Europeans wanted to create a just resolution, they would have ethnically cleansed and genocided Austria and called it Israel and given Austria to the Jewish population and said, this should be yours. After all, Hitler was Austrian. But that wasn't the end goal. The goal was never to create a just outcome. The goal was to somehow export the population out of Europe. And then in the process, hurt another brown population.
Okay, so this is going to be like, we had not really questions, but it's my final prompt, but there may be some follow-ups, right? So earlier on, you spoke about how sort of the Crusades culminated to an end, really, because there wasn't enough sort of momentum behind them, because there was trade, because there was cultural ideas and exchanges and everything else. There also has been, and it's not a new thing, it's not just since sort of the war on terror, but there's been historically lots of Muslim sentiment, and also anti-European sentiment from Muslim and Arab populations. Lots of literature, lots of myths being built about Mohammedans and people in the region. So there's that element, and I think we need to talk about that. But then also, I mean, earlier on, before we actually started the recording, I mentioned that in many ways, maybe if what happens after World War I is the Fifth Crusade, then the War on Terror is the Sixth Crusade, right? So just how do we, and all of this, and again, I also mentioned earlier in our conversation the clash of civilizations, and that we all know the book by Samuel Huntington, which kind of I wouldn't say is the first time that phrase is expressed, but it's really re-put that kind of clash on the map. And given what's happening in Gaza right now, and given what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the consistent bogeyman of Iran, there is definitely there's definitely people trying to make this clash come into existence, and then of course there's lots of exchange of ideas, and there's lots of multiculturalism, and many more people are eating falafel in New York and London and hummus than they ever have, right? So there's the same interplay going on. How do you think we kind of, firstly, your thoughts on sort of the negative elements of the legacy of the Crusade, the clash elements, but also how do we move? And of course you don't have the answer to with this, but what's your thoughts on how we move beyond that? And do you think we're going to be able to, or how is it going to unravel?
I mean, this is a great question because it is such a seriously strange problem. The Israelis had a problem in the 50s and 60s because they needed to justify what they were doing, which was ethnic cleansing and sort of low-grade genocide, right? It wasn't the kind of murder that we've seen over the last 19 months, but there was definitely murder, mass incarceration, and land confiscation, destruction of economy, like low-grade, slow creep genocide. And so it was hard to justify. I mean, think about it. It's the 1950s and 60s, late 40s, and you're doing this to a population of people in the aftermath of World War II, where the world had this new sense of maybe genocide isn't great. Maybe this isn't the right thing to do. To make this make sense, the Israelis had to rely on two things. One was good old-fashioned racism. At the end of the day, they knew they could count on Europeans to view white lives as having more value than brown and black lives. So that wasn't a problem for them. They already had that in place. There was nothing new or interesting or strange about it. For the record, that colorism was born in Spain. And the reason it was born in Spain, right, we think of it as such a, typical UK or US way of thinking. It was actually born in Spain. And the reason it was born there was the Christians, as they were pushing the border south and defeating Muslim states and pushing until they got it down to the Kingdom of Granada and then they finished it off, they wanted to have a hierarchy of Christianness. And what they decided was that it was a genetic thing, that the browner you were, or the darker you were, the more Muslim DNA or Jewish DNA you had, and the lighter your skin was, the less Jewish and Muslim DNA you had, and the more Christian your ancestors were. And so as a result, you wanted to be as light-colored as possible, and they began using the word white to describe the lightest-colored people. And so in this really strange way, anti-Muslim feelings and anti-brown and anti-black racism are intimately intertwined in European civilization. And so the Israelis had that. They could work off that. The problem they had was that the world did start to look at this with a little bit more skepticism. Like what the British were doing in Kenya wasn't quite right anymore. People were beginning to question, should the British be doing this in Kenya? And what the French were doing in Algeria and Vietnam wasn't registering with people very well. So the Israelis added a second dimension. And the second dimension was to try to villainize Arabs and Muslims in every instance they could, in art, in literature, in movies, wherever and whenever they could. And they launched a propaganda campaign that was wildly successful that portrayed Arabs as inherently anti-Semitic, that they just hated Jews at their core. And the Israelis even did false flag terrorist attacks in places like Iraq to try and show how, look, the Arabs keep hurting us and attacking us. And it worked. It was wildly successful because at the end of the day, the American population, especially, but Europe as well, began to start to see this as a Jewish-Muslim struggle, a Jewish struggle that was for the survival of the Jewish people against this tyrannical, massive Muslim horde. And it's unfortunate because it means that there's this long-lasting legacy that's deep in U.S. culture. I'll give you a personal example, an anecdotal example. In 1991, I was a kid, but I was at a university in the United States, and I was protesting the first genocidal massacre of Iraq that the United States did. And, was it right for Iraq to invade Kuwait? Absolutely not. Was the proper response this brutal war? I disagreed with it, and so I felt it was important to protest it. And at one point, I got this idea to paint the yellow ribbons, because they're putting yellow ribbons around the trees, to spray paint them red so it looked like they were blood splattered. And but I was worried if I got the spray paint on the trees, I would be accused of destroying the environment. So I sprayed my hands with the red paint and then smeared the yellow ribbons. And so it looked like I had blood-covered hands. It was hilarious. I didn't mean for it, but a woman walked up to me and she was wearing, I'll never forget it, she was wearing this really classy, like, business dress that was red. So it was like contrasting. And, she looked like she was straight out of England, but she had a Texas drawl, so she was obviously a native Texan. And she said, "You deserve to die like the Iraqis." And the thought in my head was, oh my God, lady, you think the Iraqis deserve to die? Like, this isn't a war to liberate Kuwait. You want to genocide Iraq. This isn't, oh my God, Saddam Hussein did something wrong, we need to straighten this out. This is, I want to drop bombs on apartments and kill babies. If you think the Iraqis deserve to die, I didn't care that she thought I deserved to die. Who cares? I just couldn't believe the other end of the equation. And that's what I've encountered my entire time living in the United States, is there is this profound, deep in the bones, in the marrow, just blind hatred of Arabs and Muslims that in many ways I think is actually a reflection of U.S. inherent anti-Semitism, not just because Arabs are Semites. I don't want to get into like, oh, that's what you mean. I think it's replaced it to a degree. Because it's no longer okay to express their hatred towards Jews. I have no doubt that the hatred for Jews is high. We see it, right? In the last few years, we've seen an uptick in anti-Semitic attacks. But what I think has happened, because it's so taboo to say it publicly, they've redirected that hatred into the Arab population, and then they can still express their hatred publicly, because you can say anti-Arab stuff. The president does it all the time and gets away with it. And it's okay. And the fact that it's okay is really shocking and amazing to me. And of course, all of that gets conflated into anti-Muslim stuff. But people forget there are Jewish Arabs and there are Christian Arabs and there are Druze Arabs. This isn't Christian versus Muslim. This isn't Jewish versus Muslim. It is an ethnic war. It is an anti-Arab struggle. It expands, and there's no doubt the United States hates Iranians too, and the United States would love to do this to Persians as well. It's just, I think Iran is too powerful and nobody has the guts to lose another war. Look, you couldn't defeat Iraq. There's no way you're going to defeat Iran. You couldn't win in Afghanistan. How are you going to beat a country like Iran? It's like madness. It's why there hasn't been an attack yet, because it doesn't end well for the attacker. So,
you mentioned this deep, that you've noticed this deep sort of hatred, and I think the Ben Shapiros and Douglas Murrays, and to some extent even Jordan Peterson of this world, and the other the right podcasters have made this very clear, and they get away with a lot. And they've kind of weaponized this identity further, right? But at the same time, there's massive demographic shifts happening, and there's a big power shift that's been occurring over the last 3 decades. Not just China, but the Gulf has a lot of money now. India is kind of rising. People who don't have white pigment are increasingly gaining economic power, both in Western capitals and globally. And so, how sustainable do you think this white vehemence is? And I fear that, as it becomes unsustainable, it's going to become more violent. And just what's your thoughts on that? That will be the final thoughts, and then you can go and enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon.
So I think you're right. I think it will become more violent, and we're seeing it. I think this is why Trump was elected. So over the course of the last 60 years in the United States, the white population is actually not just shrinking as a percentage of the population, it's actually begun to shrink as an actual number. I forget what the population drop was between the 2010 and 2020 census. I want to say it was something like there's 7 million fewer whites. And it's because whites have negative population growth in Europe and the United States. And so as a result, the white population is shrinking, not just in relationship as a percentage, but as a straight number. In Texas, I think whites are now like 33% of the population. They control every political institution. They're totally in control of the economy. But it's like apartheid South Africa because they're this minority that tyrannizes the majority. And I believe that the demographic shift in the United States now is 0.4% per year. The white population as a percentage of the population shrinks by 0.4. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do the math on this. If whites are 59% of the population, then in 25 years, whites will no longer be a majority. And that's why Trump was elected. White people stopped making babies, they panicked, and then they wanted to bring in this tough guy who was going to say everything racist they were thinking and do every racist policy that they wanted. And that's why Europe is freaking out and acting the way it is, because of the anti-immigrant sentiment. What's interesting to me, and you hinted at it with your thing, that's why I'm bringing it in. If you look at where AfD, which did very well in the last election in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, isn't that a great name? The Nazi Party, the new Nazi Party in Germany. They're not the alternative. They're going the guys who want to make it 1933 again. Make the world 1933 again. They did really well in East Germany. Like if you look at a map of the electoral result, the East German border is there. Like it's crazy. It's West Germany, East Germany, boom. And the reason they did so well there, interestingly enough, is because of the following. Where there are high immigrant populations, and you got to remember, becoming a German citizen is really difficult. So when I say high immigrant populations, I don't mean those immigrants have become German citizens and started to vote. I mean that they are non-voting people living in Germany. Where there are high immigrant populations, the AfD doesn't do well. It did well in former East Germany, where there isn't a high immigrant population. So the other map you can do is you can put where the immigrants are in Germany, and it looks identical to the map where the AfD did well in Germany, where the lack of contact with immigrants causes paranoia and anti-immigrant hatred. So one of the hopes for humanity is that the more contact you have with the other, with the mysterious, exotic, scary other, the more you understand them, the less likely you are to hate them. Which is why it can't be a surprise to anybody. The big metropolitan areas in the United States are places where you see at least a degree of tolerance and a degree of acceptance. It's the rural parts of the United States where you're seeing the backlash and the anti-immigrant sentiment. And the same is true in places in Europe as well, right? Like if you look at the Brexit vote in the UK, the highly educated Scots, London, even Bristol, all voted against Brexit. It was the rural parts of England that voted for Brexit. And then, of course, one of the things that we know happens to people in their old age is they become isolated because their friends start dying off and their family stops interacting with them. And people who are isolated for prolonged periods of time become paranoid and paranoid people vote for extreme far right. And so there's also this age demographic factor that's kicked in, especially because the boomers only had one kid each. And so they don't have the kind of children to support them, and they've become isolated and paranoid, and then they're voting for these extremists. And so one of the things that I think could be a hope is Gen Z. I really like, I mean, I've been a professor and a teacher for a long time. And, I started with Gen X, and then I went to millennials, and now I'm on Gen Z. And I feel like Gen Z has an understanding of the world that the other two generations didn't. Millennials are close, but I feel like Gen Z is one step ahead. And I feel like that demographic shift could ultimately, if Gen Z starts to vote, maybe help alleviate some of the crazy that the boomers and Gen X have. I'm X generation, but my generation isn't. We're X because we're an unknown variable. We're going to die as an unknown variable. We didn't do anything, and we're voting right wing now, which is embarrassing. Like, how did this happen? Why is this happening? I think we're seeing the death throes. When empires collapse, they go out violently. That's usually the case. I mean, right, the British Empire didn't, but that's because it had a 350-pound, 70 IQ son to take over. And so it felt like, all right, we'll just hand it over to our guerrilla child, and it'll be fine. But usually when empires collapse, they go out in a thrashing fit. And I think that's what Trump and the United States are doing right now. They're in that moment. My hope is that it doesn't end up a disaster. You mentioned the GCC having money, India having money, China having money. I think that's also a little bit of the hope for the world. Not the current government in India by any means, but India has a history of being a stable democracy. And my thinking is, if it can get past this Modi Hindutva kind of right-wing racism that Hungary and the United States are experiencing, India will become a beacon of hope for the whole world. I like what the GCC has been doing. It's been really exciting watching them, work on technologies and do major cultural shifts. Scandinavia is still a place of hope, even though it's not quite as great as it used to be. So there are places that give me pause in my moments of like despair.
Yeah, no, I mean, even Africa's going to be the fastest growing continent, both in terms of population and economy in the next while, and I think that's
totally.
It's going to be a massive shift. Professor Roy Casagranda, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, as always. Thank you so much for your time, and until next time.
All right, thank you so much for having me.
Cool, thank you.